My name is Maren Elfred. I'm a lecturer at King's College London, and I'm happy to present at ECER as part of the panel International Organizations and the Rise of a Global Metrological Field. I will present my research on the history of educational planning, titled In the Shadow of the Cold War, Educational Planning and the Rise of Global Governance of Education After World War II, which was funded by the National Academy of Education Spencer Foundation. I do a lot of historical research as I'm interested in studying the developments in education that led up to the present time and present phenomena in education. And the history of educational planning in the 1960s is interesting because many phenomena started during that period that we are still critically discussing today, such as the rise of the value-free development expert, a managerial and scientific, technical and apolitical approach to education, the rise of a global governance system, and the influence of powerful philanthropic foundations and international organizations in education. To illustrate some of these issues, I would like to show you a photo of a meeting of educational planners held in 1964 at the Villa Serbelloni, the conference center of the Rockefeller Foundation in Bellagio. The Rockefeller Foundation was quite invested in education at the time, as well as the Ford Foundation. The people on this photo were educational planners who worked at the international organizations engaged in education in developing countries at the time, such as UNESCO, the OECD, and the World Bank, and the newly created International Institute for Educational Planning, which belonged to UNESCO, as well as ministries, aid agencies, and NGOs involved in development. This was a small group of people who were trained in newly established educational planning or economics of education programs at US and UK universities such as Harvard, Stanford, Chicago, and the London School of Economics. And they advised the newly independent countries in Asia and Africa on their education programs and education systems. And their work was often funded by international organizations such as the World Bank. This is the period when the economics of education were discovered. Education was seen as an investment in economic growth and productivity and became a foreign policy issue in the context of the Cold War, when both the United States and the Soviet Union were competing for influence in what was then called the Third World. If you look at the first row, the fourth person in the front row, that was Philip Coombs, who represents like no other the intersections and entanglements between the US government, philanthropic foundations, universities, and international organizations that characterized the rise of a global governance system. Before being appointed in 1961 as the Secretary of State for Education and Culture to the Kennedy administration, he had held the position of Director of Research of the Fund for the Advancement of Education of the Ford Foundation. He had also worked as a professor of economics at Amherst College and a consultant to several business organizations. Coombs' career was quite typical in the field of educational planning at the time, moving between business, international organizations, the government, and academia. Another example is Robert McNamara, who was a trustee at the Ford Foundation before he served as Secretary of State and then became President of the World Bank. These Western US educated white men represented a modernist vision of the rational human being endowed by science. Their approaches, tools, way of doing things were postulated as universal, as scientific and legitimized by governments, universities, and powerful international organizations. And their view of education has shaped the possibilities within which our thinking of education is set to this day. We still see it in the instrumental, technical, output-oriented approach to education that underpins the PISA study, in the skills discourse, and the learning metrics that characterize global educational frameworks, such as Sustainable Development Goal 4. So I hope to see some of you at our panel, which will include other interesting papers by Soteria Gregg, Clara Fontevilla, and Christian Edison that examine the interactions of international organizations in the transnational field of education measurement. Thank you very much.